How do historians use new information and findings to expand our knowledge of history? Let's find out how historians have revisited information about ancient China by considering how contextualization influences what we know about history. What is history? History is the study of past events. In studying the past, historians know what they know based on whatever evidence is available to them, which means our understanding of history is based on their interpretations. New discoveries in archaeology, technology, science, and language happen all the time. This means that what we know about the past is not set in stone and can actually change over time. Once historians have gathered their evidence, they engage in the historical thinking skill of sourcing. Sourcing is the act of questioning a piece of evidence and trying to determine if it's trustworthy. When sourcing, historians ask how people's biases or perspectives might shape their story. As a reader, it's important to keep in mind that each person sees the world in a particular way. When we read history and keep that in mind, we're sourcing. Bias is a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, etc., are better than others. Bias is influenced by a person's life experience and values. Even if an author claims to be neutral, anything written by him or her will have some small amount of bias, of which readers need to be aware. Sourcing evidence. In order to source a piece of evidence, we ask the following questions of the source. What claim does the author make? What evidence does the author use? What language does the author use to persuade the document's audience? If the source is a translation of the original, how might that affect what we know about the source? When and where was the document created? How might the time and place of when the document was created shape its content? You will consider sourcing to determine how scholarship on the Qing dynasty, more specifically how the understanding of leadership of Qing Shi Huangdi, was changed over time. Scholarship is the term historians use to describe the body of formal study or research and publication on a subject. Document 1. Records of the Grand Historian. Keep in mind that this is a modified excerpt from the Records of the Grand Historian, Sima Qian. Master Ho and Master Lu plotted together, saying, "The first emperor is by nature obstinate, cruel, and self-willed. He rose up from among the feudal rulers to unite the entire empire, and now that he has achieved his ends and fulfilled his desires, he believes that there has never been anyone like him since remote antiquity. He entrusts everything to the law officials, and the law officials alone are allowed into his presence. Although 70 men have been appointed as academicians, they are mere figureheads and are never consulted. The Li Si, Chancellor, and other major officials are all handed decisions that have already been made, and they simply second the emperor's opinion. The emperor delights in showing his authority by punishing and killing, and everyone throughout the empire dreads punishment and tries merely to maintain his position, none more daring to exert true loyalty. The emperor never learns of his mistakes, and hence grows daily more arrogant. Qing law forbids a person to practice more than one kind of magical art, and if he fails to show results, he is summarily put to death. There are 300 men who practice the art of divining by the stars and exhalations, all of them experts, but they are so terrified of giving offense that they merely flatter the ruler and do not dare speak out and tell him his faults. The first emperor also ordered the imperial secretary to subject all the scholars to investigation. The scholars reported on one another in an attempt to exonerate themselves. Over 460 persons were convicted of violating the prohibitions and were executed at Xiangyang, word of it being publicly throughout the empire so as to act as a warning to later ages. In addition, increasing numbers of convicts were transported to the border regions. Keep in mind that the word translated here as executed can also mean to bury alive. Commentators who are eager to emphasize the evil nature of the first emperor usually use this meaning. So let's consider sourcing this evidence. Remember these questions? What do you think? What claim does the author make? What evidence does the author use? What language does the author use to persuade the document's audience? If the source is a translation of the original, how might that affect what we know about the source? When and where was the document created? And how might the time and place of when the document was created shape its content? Now let's consider a second document. Document 2. China, a History. Han Dynasty and later historians describe the first emperor of the Qing dynasty as a villain and the founding emperor of Han as a moral example in the mode of Confucius. In addition to the writing, of course, Shing Shihuangdi was interested in regulating what was written. In response to a Confucian scholar's recommendation that Sheng Shihuang enfeoff his brothers and sons as past kings had done, Li Si, Sheng Shihuang's chancellor, is said to have responded with an intense rejection of the idea and a critique of scholars who misled the common people with their teachings. His solution: destroy publicly circulating copies of the various philosophical writings, the texts that later generations called Confucian classics, and the histories of all states other than Qing. Books on useful topics such as divination, forestry, agriculture, and medicine were exempt from destruction. Sheng Shihuan acted on this recommendation. He is also said to have become so angry with some scholars who were criticizing him that he had 470 of them killed, some say buried alive. This is probably a story concocted in the Han Dynasty as part of Han historians' denigration of the Qing. Nonetheless, this story, along with the more reliable account of the destruction of the books, gave the first emperor the reputation of a ruthless dictator who specially hated scholars and scholarship. It is impossible to argue that the ruler who created a huge empire through a series of bloody wars was a kindly gentleman who practiced the virtues praised by Confucius. However, the first emperor did support an academy of 70 scholars, some of whom were traditionalists. His laws were certainly not anything that Confucius would have approved of, but they were no harsher than those of the other states have been. So once again, let's consider: what claims does this author make? What evidence does this author use? What language does this author use to persuade the document's audience? If the source is a translation of the original, how might that affect what we know about the source? When and where was this document created? How might the time and place of when the document was created shape its content? And now think, why would a historian from the Han Dynasty write negatively about Sheng Shihuangdi? To summarize, after reading both documents, how are these two documents similar? How are they different? What can we learn about how historians understand the past? Moving forward, as historical thinkers, what do we need to consider when trying to understand the past? Remember that being critical thinkers is an important part of learning about history.